Well, hi again. Has it been too long? I hope. Maybe about 2 days. Yeah, I think maybe 2 days. Today, we will be going over status effects that weapons realistically should have. Just for time's sake, we're only going to really be doing this for the armory weapons instead of all of the craft weapons, because that'll take way too long. So, starting off, I'm going to be very, very obvious throughout this whole video. I'm telling y'all that this should have bleed and stun. This should have bleed. This should have bleed and stun. And then detector, automatic, 4 times zoom. It should also poison the enemy and inflict bleed. Inflict bleed. Inflict bleed. Stun and inflict bleed. Inflict bleed. Stun and inflict bleed. 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 Okay, this one's an interesting one. Huh. Because the bullets seem a little blunt, so I don't know if they'd actually pierce the body. So I can't say for certain if this would actually inflict bleed or not. For all I know, the damage this weapon could cause could be internal damage. So, this is gonna be the first weapon I say is fine as it is. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts burn and bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. You already inflict bleed, so you're fine the way you are. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Again, these is one of those weapons that don't really look like they penetrate you. So, I'm gonna have a hard time thinking whether or not this should inflict bleed or not. I'm just gonna go for a no. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts burn and bleed. Inflicts burn and bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts stun and bleed. Inflicts bleed and stun. Huh. Water rifle. Let me think. It's fine the way it is. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts stun. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts stun. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. This is technically a very hot substance, so it should inflict burn and therefore, by extension, inflict bleed. Inflict bleed. Inflict bleed. Inflict stun. Inflict stun and bleed. Inflict stun and bleed. Inflict stun and bleed. Inflict bleed. Dang, I'm saying inflict way too many times. My tongue is messing up. As I was saying though, inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Oh, and stun. And stun. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts stun, because it already inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Now this is interesting, because it definitely inflicts bleed. But considering status effects like super poison exist in the game, I'm gonna say this weapon would inflict super bleed. From the fact that its fire rate is so rapid, it would leave multiple holes in you, causing you to bleed out extremely fast. So I think it deserves the title of heavy bleed as a status effect. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed and stun. Inflicts stun. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed and stun. Bleed and stun. Blind. Yes, blind. This would inflict blind. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Bleed and stun. Bleed. Bleed and stun. Maybe even bleed, stun, and electric shock. Inflicts bleed. Already inflicts bleed. Inflicts bleed. Inflicts... Huh. When you're close range and the chainsaw effect... When the chainsaw effect occurs, that's when it should stun. Inflicts stun, cancel jumps, and bleed. On top of everything else it says down here. Stun. Invisible after kill. And that's it, really. Do I even need to justify why this should inflict super bleed? Like, come on. Come on. Like, let's use common sense. And what earth is being shot by this weapon not tear you into meaty little cubes? Yeah, this should inflict super bleed. Okay. Bleed. Bleed. Burn and bleed. Burn and bleed. Bleed. Burn and bleed. 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 Poison and bleed. Fine as it is. Bleed. 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 Oh yeah, this pierces straight through your body. So it should bleed and it should also monster blast. It looks like it would be hot, so burn and bleed. Poisonous candy. It's fine as it is. Let me think about that. It's fine how it is. Stun, bleed. Stun, bleed. You're fine as you are. Blind. Yeah, this should blind. Bleed. Bleed. Super bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun, blind, and bleed on top of its weakening. Super poison. Bleed. 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 Fine as you are. Bleed. 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 Super bleed. Bleed. Fine as you are. Bleed. Bleed. Super bleed. Super bleed. And stun. Stun. And bleed. 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 bleed, 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 and bleed and stun. Wow. We are only halfway through. And this is already, what, a 7-minute long video? Dang, I made a good choice not going through the craft and doing all these weapons as well. Because that would have taken absolutely forever. Anyway, bleed. Fine as it is. This depends. Because if you whack someone over the head with it, it should inflict bleed. But if you get hit by the area damage, it shouldn't inflict bleed. If anything, it should inflict electric shock, because this is literally electric currents coming out of the weapon and hitting you as the area damage. Therefore, a direct hit should inflict bleed, and an area damage hit should inflict electric shock. Realistically speaking. Demon Sword. Stun and super bleed. Fine as you are. Again, very situational. Under certain circumstances, I can see it inflicting bleed. But, nah, it's fine as it is. Bleed. Fine as you are. Who would genuinely bleed from a ruler? This is fine as it is. Fine as it is. Bleed. Bleed. Fine as it is. Fine as it is. Bleed. And stun. Bleed and stun. Bleed. Bleed. Fine as it is. Bleed. 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 Oh, bleed and stun. Bleed. Bleed. Blind and bleed. Invisibility after kill. Lifesteal. Lifesteal and bleed. 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 Bleed and acceleration after kill. Acceleration after kill. Bleed. Oh yeah, by the way, bleed as well for that. Bleed. More damage to the cursed and bleed. 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 Bleed and stun. Bleed. Acceleration after kill. And let me think. Acceleration after kill. Yeah, acceleration after kill, electric shock, and stun. Oh, and by the way, bleed. Fine as you are. Bleed. Bleed. Acceleration after kill, and invisibility after kill. Debatable whether this is I'm just gonna say stun. Bleed and stun. More damage to the curse. Bleed and stun. More damage to the cursed. Bleed and stun. Bleed, burn, and stun. Bleed and stun. Bleed and stun. Bleed and stun. Bleed. Acceleration after kill. Fine as it is. Bleed. Fine as it is. Bleed. Okay. Fine as it is. Bleed. 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 No. Fine as it is. Fine as it is. Stun and electric shock. Stun and blind. Bleed. Bleed and stun. Bleed. Fine as it is. Stun and electric shock. Or electric shock. One or the two. Bleed. 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 Oh, electric shock. Fine as it is. Electric shock. Definitely. 100%. Bleed. Oh, you already have bleed, so fine as it is. Bleed. Bleed. And electric shock. Fine as it is. Bleed. Bleed. I already have bleed, okay. Already, you're fine. You're fine. Burn and stun. Stun. Wait, no, not stun. What am I on? No, burn and bleed. Burn and bleed. Burn and bleed. Bleed. Freeze. Okay, as is. Stun for sure. This deserves to stun for sure if you're hit with it. Stronger barrier, please. This weapon is like legitimately trash in every sense of the word. I don't even think it would be good at mythical. I'm getting besides the point though. Bleed. Bleed. I'm debating freeze, bleed, fine as is, bleed, bleed, fine as is, fine as is. Let me think. Perhaps blind, bleed, electric shock. Fine as is, bleed, bleed. Definitely super poison. How strong this is, super poison. Super poison. Burn, bleed. Another one of those weapons that doesn't directly penetrate you, so I can't say it inflicts bleed. Let me think. Let me think. It's fine. Bleed. Bleed. Fine as is. Bleed. No, definitely not. This is fine as is. Bleed for sure. Bleed bleed and stun. Oh, you already do that, technically. This should not only cancel your jumps, it should also stun you and inflict a bleed. This would inflict super bleed. Bleed. More damage to the curse. And all the status effects it already has. Slows target and bleed. Slows target and bleed. Slows target, invisibility after kill. Okay. 2 more to go. 2 more to go. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna do heavy section first. This weapon is ironically really good with high mods. Like, I one-tap people with this. Or sometimes 2-tap. That's really good for a common efficiency 5 weapon. Having said that, it deserves blood. Let me just say blood. I meant bleed and burn. Bleed and burn. Bleed and burn. Bleed and burn. Oh, and stun. Stun, bleed and burn. Stun, bleed and burn. I'm just gonna say this now. You're going to hear me say stun for the heavy section a lot, because heavy sections are heavy. Shocker, I know. They're supposed to pop a punch, so it only makes sense that most of these heavy weapons will inflict stun. As saying that, this would inflict burn and bleed, stun, fine as is, stun for sure, bleed, stun and bleed, stun and bleed, bleed, stun and bleed, stun and bleed, stun and bleed, fine as it is, stun and bleed, fine as it is, stun and bleed. Invisibility after kill and more damage to the curse. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun, burn 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 and bleed. Stun and bleed. Bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn. No. Never mind. I retract that statement. Just bleed. 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 Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Actually, no. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Blind. Yeah, just blind and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Invisible after kill, more damage to the cursed. Stun, burn, no. Stun, bleed, and disable jumps. Stun, bleed, and blind. Stun, bleed, stun, bleed. No, stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. fine as it is. Stun, burn, and bleed. Stun, burn, and bleed. Also, more damage to the curse. More damage to the curse. Also, bleed or poison. Bleed. Super rocket jump. Bleed. Oh, and stun. Bleed. Electric shock. Deserves electric shock. And of course, super bleed and stun. Stun, burn, and stun. Okay, finally, we made it to the sniper category. This is the last category before we are done ranking the weapons based on what status effects they should realistically have. Goes without saying, stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Oh, and electric shock. Charm. Definitely. This should have charm. Charm. Bleed and stun. Blind. Bleed. Stun and 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 bleed. Stun. Bleed. And stun, bleed, and actually, stun and bleed is good enough. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Actually, no. Just bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. 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 Stun and bleed. Electric shock. Stun and bleed. 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 And stun. Also stun. Oh yeah, definitely. Stun, bleed, and burn. Stun, bleed, bleed, and burn. Oh, and stun, bleed, and burn. Actually, no, just bleed. Stun, bleed, and burn. Stun and bleed. 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 Actually, wait a second. Invisibility after kill. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Invisible after kill. Already has charm, so that's good. Invisible after kill. More damage to the cursed. Restore ammo. Already disables jump, so it stuns. Electric shock. Stun and bleed. Stun and bleed. Stun for sure. Like, there's no reason this weapon shouldn't stun once you're hit by it. Same here. No way you take a shot from a weapon that looks like this and aren't stunned. Stun and bleed. Oh, by the way, bleed, obviously. conditional. That's a bleed. Definitely a bleed. This is extra points and bleed. 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 Also heals you by a certain percentage every second. Sniper monster. Bleed. Yeah, bleed and stun. Already has stun, so bleed. And then you're fine as you are, just add stun. And then stun, bleed, and freeze. Well, there you have it. All weapons and the armor and what their status effects should be on top of what's already on. This